I think you end up with these two very different visions in Islam and Christianity. Islam is ultimately good advice. Human beings, you tend to forget things, you tend to make mistakes. Here's some advice. Christianity, on the other hand, comes along and says, no, you actually need rescuing. You actually need a rescuer.
Today on Reset, we are going back to the beginning with Dr. Andy Bannister. He is the director of the Solas Centre for Public Christianity and the author of many books, including The Atheist Who Didn't Exist and Do Muslims and Christians Believe in the Same God? Thank you so much for joining us on Reset.
Glenn, it's a delight to be with you as ever. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolute pleasure. As I give that description of former books that you've written, in fact, the second book is forthcoming, isn't it? It's the Do Muslims and Christians?
Yeah, the second one you mentioned is due out on the 18th of March, I think. Yeah.
Very good. And so that's a fairly good sort of description of a kind of a twin focus in your public ministry, isn't it? You're very interested in Islam and very interested in atheism. Why is that?
Well, it's interesting. I never quite thought of it as that, but actually, the more I've come to realize, those two books do feel like kind of sort of bookends to a lot of thinking. Firstly, Glenn, it's sort of accidental. Although, of course, I guess you like being Christians, we don't really think there are any accidents, but it's partly accidental in one sense, in that it was conversations with Muslims on the streets of London in the late 1990s drew me into just a fascination with Islam. And when I was looking to do academic work, I thought there's whole areas here that haven't been studied. So I thought I'd go that route. And so that's kind of laid one track. But then as I was doing speaking in universities and workplaces and cafes and coffee shops, all the sort of thing I do in itinerant speaking life, lots of the folk I was coming across were atheists. And then around the same time as that was all kicking off, then the new atheism took off in 2006 with Dawkins' book. I think it was 2006, Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and Sam Harris and all that. I remember thinking, oh, this is interesting. So those two things developed. And then as I began doing more speaking and then writing on those, Glenn, I began to realize there are actually intersections between those things. There are actually more similarities, funnily enough, between some of the way that atheism functions as a worldview and some of the ways that Islam functions as a worldview. So it's been a fascinating journey seeing those things blend together and so forth.
I'd love to explore what some of those similarities are. I mean, one way I've kind of thought about Islam and our modern Western forms of atheism is that both of them seem to be diversions from Orthodox Christianity. One is a 7th century diversion from Orthodox Christianity, and the other is a 17th century sort of diversion from Orthodox Christianity. Is it helpful to see their relationship to Christianity in that way?
Well, I think so. I think there's a couple of things going on, right? If we believe, as you and I do, that Christianity is the true story of reality, then of course anything is a diversion from it, and you can divert in different ways. You can divert in religious ways, you can divert in secular ways, and I do think in some ways atheism and Islam are, on the one hand, mirror images of each other, but also in other ways interplay in strange ways. But the way the Bible actually reflects that in a few places, it's funny that whenever I read Luke 15, just to give you one example of how this plays out, so the parable of the father and the two sons, sometimes known as the parable of the prodigal son, but of course there's another elder son in that story. Of course, you've got the younger son in that story. I often think reminds me of atheism. He wants nothing to do with his father. He's taken all of the goodies that he can grab from his dad, and he's run off and is pursuing, very much his own way of the world. And that in some ways feels a little bit like some forms of atheism. I have many atheist friends who want nothing to do with God, but they do want the things that I think many of us would say are grounded on faith in God. They want human rights, they want beauty, they want justice, they want a bit of meaning in life and so forth. So they remind me of the prodigal son, the younger son. But then you've got the elder son who, is out there in the field at the end of the story, grumbling at his father, totally legalistic. All these years, Dad, I kept everything you asked me to do. I worked like a slave. And wants, nothing really to do with that sort of warm relational embrace that his father is offering to both sons. So he's responding like a Muslim. It's all about the law, and it's through the law that you earn self-worth. And I often read Luke 15 with my eye on those two worldviews, funnily enough.
That's fascinating. And the third option is the father, the running father, who runs out to embrace the younger son. And then has a conversation with the elder son. What is the third way, do you think, that Christianity offers, and how is it distinct from those two other ways?
Well, I think what's interesting is that, I actually in the last chapter of the new book, I actually end on Luke 15 and make the point that what's interesting, we know how the youngest son responds. He reaches rock bottom out there in the pigsty, realizes he can't go any lower. Then he gets into his head that, okay, the way back into Dad's affections is to go back and earn myself back in. I need to go. He works out this speech where he says, Dad, I'll come work for you. Take me on as one of your hired servants. Because I think in his brain, he's thinking, well, if I can just earn enough cash, I can pay my dad back for the inheritance I took, and it's all okay. So I think he is, again, now he's now switched from rejecting God into the self-justification way. And I think the father's response there is the third way that we see of going, no, it's not about you and what you can earn. It's about grace, and it's about what I can give to you. And of course, the father doesn't accept the offer for the son to work. Instead, he clothes him in the best robe. He puts sandals on his feet. He throws a feast for him. The father has done everything. The father has laid down his own reputation. The father has paid the price of his own self-abasement in the culture, because running as a Middle Eastern father like that doesn't score sort of highly in an honor shame culture. And the father's done all of that, and forgiveness has been paid for by the dad, because forgiveness is free. I think that's the third way, Glenn, that you're alluding to there. That there's something by the very nature of forgiveness; it has to be free to the receiver. And I think both, and I think the mistake that Islam makes, represented by the older son in that story, is the idea that you earn it. That it's it's by keeping, it's good behavior, it's doing the right thing, it's keeping your nose clean, that you can somehow build up this sort of a collection of merit points, as it were, with God, that will then earn you acceptance and welcome into God's eternal future, into paradise. But I'm always saying to my Muslim friends, of going, that's very interesting, and I am happy to talk about that, but have you noticed something? All the emphasis is placed on you. And that's another thing I think that atheism and Islam have in common. Islam indirectly. Atheism is all about you, because if you don't believe in God, you tend to make yourself God. You don't necessarily mean to, but that's what you end up doing. And Islam, again, puts the spotlight on you, because it's your good works, your law keeping, your obedience that really is where the focus, where the spotlight is placed. Whereas in Christianity, the third way, that spotlight is swung over to Jesus, and it's him who's lived the life that you should have lived. It's he who's died the death that you should have died, so that he can offer you the forgiveness that only he can bring.
Brilliant. So we've been thinking about the meaning crisis, as many people are kind of dubbing it today. So, and that could be very well characterized by the younger son running off into the far country. In what senses have we in the West departed from home? What have been the steps that have taken us away from home and left us in a bit of a pigsty? What would you point to, sort of historically and culturally?
Oh gosh, we're covering everything today. And there's a whole number of staging posts on that road, Glenn. I think one of the staging posts early on is I think Christians, we need to take a bit of responsibility for that, because I think as we had a tendency, we still do in some places, to institutionalize religion. And I mean, if there's one thing that Jesus warns you against, is institutionalizing kind of religion and locking people down with systems and structures and thinking that they in themselves have merit. I think historically we did that in the Western church, particularly. Other parts of the church too, but as a Western Christian, let me speak for my own tradition. And I think people have reacted against that. And that's why today you meet many people who will say things like, I want nothing to do with organized religion. But you talk to them, they're spiritual. They're interested in spiritual things. I think my next door neighbors, they wouldn't call themselves atheists. You can talk about spiritual things with them. But the moment it gets into, this looks like religion, they're like, no, thank you. Because they've associated that with the church and power and control and meddling in politics. So I think that step along the way didn't help. I think in many parts of the church, we responded, to a lot of the sort of development and things like kind of modern science and stuff quite badly. I think we didn't develop our apologetics, to use that word, that branch of Christian theology concerned with giving a reason. So we just ignored some of the big kind of cultural questions that were going on. And so we produced a generation of young people grow up in the church with no foundation for what they believed. I have friends who I was at school with, 30 years ago, who back then were on fire Christians, and now have sort of wandered away. I think you talk to them, it's like, well, I don't believe that anymore. There's no reasons for it, really. It was a phase, but why would I still be a Christian? And now I think, Glenn, we're coming into a sort of third stage where I think the cultural narrative is shifting, from rather than Christianity is, messy and tied up with politics and Christianity has no evidence going for it. Now we're into this age where everything is about the sexual revolution and everything about, identity and sexuality and transgender and all these other issues that are floating around. And Christians are now being painted as, well, we're the bad guys. You guys are on the wrong side of history. Christianity is bad because it holds people back from self-expression and all these other things. And so again, I think Christians find themselves a bit on the back foot. So that was those are definitely 3 staging posts on the road. We can fill in more detail, but I think those are definitely part of the story.
And equivalently in the Islamic world, is there any kind of convulsion that's happening at the moment that you could sort of put your finger on, or is it like the elder brother is still pretty much at home, still pretty much where he was?
I think Islam is a slightly different beast for a number of reasons. Firstly, because Islam traditionally, and I've got to be careful when we say Islam, right? Because there are a wide variety of expressions of Islam. There are lots of different Muslims expressing their faith in different ways. One of my Muslim friends used to say to me that, when we have 3 Muslims gathered together, Andy, we have 5 opinions. And I think there's some truth in that. And I said, well, that's nothing compared to Christians. We can probably double that number. But in general, Glenn, I think Islam is a much more monolithic faith, because Islam has always blended, politics and culture in there with the faith, which traditionally Christians have tried to separate a little bit more. So the whole thing is kind of glued together in Islam, which gives Islam a much stickier quality. Here in the West, you can be raised in a Christian home and perhaps walk away from your Christian faith, and there are very few consequences. Your parents will still be friends with you. There are no implications for your job and your career and
You're
other
not
kind of
disinherited
not disinherited or anything. I mean, occasionally you get horror stories, but that is by far not the norm. That's they're unusual. In Islam, it's the other way around. That to go, if you walk away from Islam, there are huge consequences. I have many friends who are former Muslims, and many of them will tell you that it was that fear of what would happen if they walked away. He died a few years ago now, but my friend Nabil Qureshi, wrote that amazing book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And Nabil in that book, very, very honest about, the huge cost it was for him to follow Christ. And the consequences were pretty dire in terms of the way that his family reacted. And so that gives a very, I think, sort of sticky quality to Islam. But press below the surface, and I think especially here in the West, and I think there's a lot of issues going on Glen. I think a lot of Muslims that I meet and talk to, I think, are struggling with the kind of sort of postmodern kind of Western culture where we find ourselves. And occasionally that bubbles to the surface. Remember, was it a year or 2 ago when there were those Muslim parents made the headlines because they were protesting that sexuality curriculum at a school down in Birmingham. And that was a really interesting moment, because I think up until that point, a lot of Western politicians have thought, oh, it's just crazy right-wing Christians, conservative Christians who are against this stuff. And then suddenly, actually, they pushed hard enough on the Muslim community, and the Muslim community stood up and went, no, thank you very much. We don't want any of that in the lives of our children. And I think a lot of Muslim parents struggle how to navigate the kind of world that we find ourselves in. And they're often the solution to doing it is you sort of create parallel tracks. And so a lot of, mosques will have education programs. I know a lot of, sort of Muslim families who sort of, have gone the homeschooling route, or, keeping their kids as shielded from the world as possible, because there really isn't in Islam the resources for how you deal with the modern world, because Islam was always built on the assumption that Muslims would be in the majority. And Zaki Badawi, who was a leading British Muslim until his death a couple of decades ago now, brilliant Muslim thinker, very moderate and generous, friendly guy. Remember, he on one occasion said, Muslim theology is a theology of the majority. The status of being in a minority was never something that was considered. And so when Muslims living in Britain, look to the Quran or Sharia law or the great works of Muslim scholarship for over 1,000 years, none of those address the question really of what do you do when you're living in a minority setting in a culture that is, virulently secular, and there are no resources, and that can be hard for them.
Well, with those two things in mind, I wonder if we could go back to the beginning, go back to Genesis chapters 1 to 3, and let's look at these verses through some Islamic goggles. Let's look at them through some atheistic goggles, and let's look at them through some Christian goggles. And I wonder if first we could think about our doctrine of humanity. So very famously, Genesis chapter 1 gives us the imago Dei, the Latin for the image of God, because God creates the male and female in his image and gives humanity dominion over the world. So you've got this setup of heaven and earth, and sort of at the intersection of heaven and earth, the fulcrum of all reality, is humanity, male and female, in the image of God. Now, first of all, help us to figure out what does that mean, Andy, and what does it mean to walk away from such a doctrine?
Oh my word! I mean, Glenn, we could spend hours on this one, because I don't know about you. Those are some of the most, for me, exciting. Well, most all the scripture is exciting, but it's one of the passages of the scripture I just get so excited about because so much stands on it. But I think what it means is, what's interesting is, if you back up a few verses, because often we get too excited and jump straight into those verses. Back up a bit. Right at the beginning, you've got some interesting things said. If you go through Genesis 1, every time some other aspect of creation is brought into existence by God, he speaks over it the words, this is good, this is good, this is good. And so, creation is created good. And the God who is the very, definition of what it means to be good and right and so forth, speaks that over the fact that his creation has that some of those qualities to it. And that's unusual because, of course, in Islam, things are just matter and motion. Things, mountains aren't good, oceans aren't good. They just are. They're just a particular configuration.
In atheism, it's just
that's
matter
really
and
all
motion.
you have. Yeah. And that's not. I'm trying to be very fair on our atheist friends here and just say, you can't really get beyond the brute fact of existence. And in Islam, there's nothing like that in the Quran. When Allah creates things in the Quran, when Allah, the God of the Quran, creates, he doesn't then speak those words over his creation. It just it's a demonstration of God's power, that God merely has to will a thing, and it is, as the Quran says, but then God doesn't speak that kind of statements over it. Well, then, of course, we come on to those verses that you referenced there. And so humankind is now created, and humankind is God says good twice over humanity, right? So we're not just good, but there's a different quality there, and we're set aside from the rest of creation because we're given dominion over the rest of creation. And dominion has this idea of responsibility and care for. It's been a word that's been a bit maligned across the years, but it doesn't mean abuse or ripped to pieces. I get nervous when Christians are sometimes taking it that way. If you send your kids off to school, you're giving the school dominion over your kids for the day. Presumably you expect to get them back in one piece at the end of the day, not sort of broken in bits and bobs. So humanity has something different about it in terms of how it stands in relation to creation. But then there's that amazing words about image bearing. And I think theologians and thinkers down through the years explored that in various ways. I think there's a relational quality to it, the way that human beings are designed for a quality of relationship with each other and with God that isn't there for the rest of the created world. I think there's certainly you could talk about the fact that we have mind and consciousness and reason and creativity, and those other kind of qualities that I think make human beings sort of stand out as a little bit different to the rest of creation. There's also moral responsibility. So, human beings have moral responsibility in a way that the rest of creation doesn't. And then, of course, ultimately, I'd say we're designed for and intended for relationship with God himself. And you see that there in Genesis. A few verses on, you see God walking and talking there in the garden with Adam and Eve. He's not taking a stroll with the badgers and the hyenas. He's walking with Adam and Eve, because there is something about us that God intended for us to be in relationship with him as sons and daughters, not just merely slaves and servants. So all of those things, I think, together are packaged into what it means to bear God's image. And the other thing you asked about, Glenn, of course, if you throw that out, if you reject that, if you ignore that, as our secular friends obviously would wish to, I think some things follow from that. And the biggest one is you have a huge problem when it comes to grounding and giving a foundation to human value, human dignity, and the things like human rights and so on. If you look at the way that human rights were sort of theories and so forth were first grounded, they were first grounded very much in a Christian worldview. It was very much the idea that human beings bear this intrinsic value because they're made in God's image. We're not just another clever animal. We're not just a rather pretty collection of atoms and particles. If you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which kind of encapsulated centuries of thinking, there is an inherent, innate value and dignity. And as Tom Holland, who I know you've even had on this show, or certainly had in conversation, you and Tom have spoken. I mean, Tom, in his magnificent book Dominion, talks about the fact we forget that's the idea that human beings have value and dignity, irrespective of class, wealth, race, background, gender. It would have been anathema to the ancient world. Every ancient civilization thought it was patently obvious that some people were valuable and some people were less valuable. And along comes Christianity and cuts right across that and goes, no, all bear value, all have dignity. And if you throw the image of God away, which is the sort of foundation of that idea, I do think you're left with the whole of human rights theory, like this amazing sort of house of cards with no bottom level on it.
Right.
And you do wonder how long it's going to. All the other image that often springs to mind, if you've ever used to watch as a kid the Roadrunner cartoon with kind of Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, you know, with those moments where Wile E. Coyote would go sort of charging off a cliff. And for about, you know, a few seconds, he'd carry on running as momentum took him forward. And then suddenly he'd crash spectacularly to the ground. Right. And I do worry that human rights theory is sort of running frantically in midair, hoping that it can carry on without the sustaining ground beneath it. But I wonder how long that will actually work.
And there are people who are saying, actually, the way forward is the way down, and we shouldn't build these castles in the air. And, you know, way back with John Stuart Mill, he called human rights nonsense on stilts. And there are many thinkers, such as Yuval Noah Harari, who are basically saying, look, the God story is mythological in exactly the same way as the human rights story is mythological. They stand or fall together, and we're better off without them.
Peter Singer would be another.
And I was going to raise Peter Singer, who you've had a conversation with very publicly on the Unbelievable show, Big Conversations. So Peter Singer is not is an ethicist and written many books on ethical behavior, and some of his ethical behaviors put many Christians, including myself, to shame, including his philanthropy and his desire to do as much good as he possibly could. But he wouldn't sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, would he?
I don't think so. I mean, I remember in that dialogue with him that I had, as you say, on the Premier Unbelievable show a few years ago with Justin Brierley, kind of moderating that conversation. I think early on, we raised the idea of human value and dignity, and he pretty much dismissed it. He didn't go quite as far as the nonsense on stilts language, but it was pretty close to it. But in one sense, I respect that tremendously. It always surprised me. I think sometimes people sort of pick up, for the likes of you and I who are Christians who engage with atheism, sometimes there's this sort of sense that, oh, you guys, must obviously dislike atheists and atheism. No, I have a huge respect for my atheist friends. I particularly have respect for atheist philosophers like Peter Singer, who are willing to try and be consistent. It's why I like Singer. It's why I like going further back, people like Nietzsche and Camus and that kind of strand of philosophy where people are willing to go. There's a price to pay for being an atheist. You can't, as Nietzsche said, you can't simply take Christianity, remove one part out of it, the belief in God, and expect the rest of the system to function. But it's certainly in many forms, I think, of contemporary, maybe more humanism, to be fair, than atheism. I mean, because you could say atheism is just the fairly sort of limited belief that there is no God. But certainly once you start bringing humanism in and trying to say that human beings have value and dignity and duties and responsibilities and privileges and so on and so forth, I think that does look, I think, nonsense on stilts is a great description without God at the heart of it.
Yeah, and Singer would say that humanism is speciesism. Okay.
Yes.
Why should we privilege? Why should we be human exceptionalists? And therefore, he wants to extend the tent of compassion that we display to creation. That can only be a good thing, can't it? Why do we draw a line around this species called humanity? Shouldn't we care for the animal kingdom as well?
Well, the circle drawing is absolutely fascinating. So, because I write there is a problem when it comes to humanism and circle drawing. So, before we talk about expanding the circle briefly, it's interesting if you look at what humanism and human rights theory without God is doing. Basically, it's saying here's a great big circle in which every living thing exists, antelopes and aardvarks and eggplants and everything is in there. And along we come as humanists and we draw a little circle somewhere around about here. I mean, smaller than that, obviously. And so, if you live in this circle, this small circle, if you have human DNA, you have a special set of rights and privileges that ants and aardvarks and eggplants don't. That sounds all very well until somebody then simply says, well, why don't we draw a smaller circle? And along comes the white supremacist who says, well, I'm going to draw a smaller circle. I'm going to say it's only Caucasian males who have these privileges and everybody else doesn't. You've got a problem because they've drawn a circle, you've drawn a circle, just that your circle is slightly bigger than theirs, and yours gets Nobel Prizes for human rights awarded, theirs gets them locked up or banned from Twitter. But what's the difference between the circle drawing? So what Peter's doing is trying to expect, say, okay, we'll rather go narrower, why don't we go broader? But the problem is he runs into a similar problem. Well, firstly, how broad do we go? would be one of my questions. I mean, okay, if you extend it out to the great apes or cats and dogs and so forth, well, what about other kind of wildlife? Why don't, we've had sort of fun, in the last few weeks with the snow here in Scotland, watching this little family of blackbirds have play out in our garden each day. Our kids love them. Well, why don't blackbirds get included in that great circle of rights? And if you go further out, why not amoeba and everything? So I think Peter, once you start expanding, has a problem of where you stop. Second, he's got a problem that obviously some parts of the natural world have responsibilities and duties that others don't. So if the fox breaks into the chicken coop and destroys all the chickens, we don't put the fox on trial for animal rights abuses. If you or I break into your neighbor's chicken shed and just let loose with a baseball bat, then again, you or I would be on trial. Why is that? We all instinctively know that there's a responsibility that we have that the rest of creation doesn't. And then finally, I guess to what Peter's saying, I'd be saying, why draw circles at all is your bigger problem. Because if everything is just atoms and particles in motion, why does anything matter? I mean, it's great, as you say, as a Christian, I can look at Peter and go, I admire his philanthropy. But that's because I'm sitting in a Christian worldview. If I'm sitting in a worldview that simply says everything is atoms and particles in motion, I do find it hard to go, well, why then bother being ethical in any shape or form? There are simply configurations of particles. Some I have a preference for, some I don't have a preference for, but I already can't get beyond preference. And what was interesting, if people have watching this, Glenn, haven't watched that interview with Peter Singer, do encourage folks to go watch it, because it's about 45, 50 minutes in, as Justin and I are both pushing him a bit on this, suddenly he kind of gives ground and says, well, I do actually think some things are actually wrong. There are actually moral values out there beyond just the kind of John Stuart Mill utilitarianism thing. And then suddenly, left, right, and center, he's populating this sort of moral platonic space with things like it's a good idea to be charitable and we shouldn't do harm to others and so forth. And I found that fascinating that he ran out of runway, because I think we all do. I think that's the ultimate choice, Glenn. Either that we live in a moral universe with a God who is just behind it, and there is right, there is wrong, there is just, there is unjust, no matter if everybody else doesn't see it, or we live in a world in which there is only preference, and those who are strong and those who are powerful get to exercise their preferences more than those of us who are lower down the food chain.
Yes, yeah. And I wonder, if there's a Tom Holland in the audience listening in, he's saying, well, it's not Plato who's giving you those ethical kind of values, is it, Peter? It is Jesus Christ. And I wonder whether in practice the line gets drawn not to the fringes of all things, because that's entirely impractical. We need to eat the eggplant at some stage, or we're going to starve. And so in practice you do need to draw a circle, but the circle that gets drawn starts to be about your conscious experience of pain or pleasure, or your conscious awareness of your own existence, and these sorts of categories, which at some stage leads you to the fairly alarming prospects that a pig has more consciousness than a 6-month-old child. Does a pig have more rights and values than a 6-month-old child? And Peter Singer has followed that line of reasoning to some quite alarming places.
He has, and I think you hit a couple of other problems too. One is that the moment you start saying, well, it's things like consciousness and reason and things that include you within the sort of circle of rights. That seems a bit suspicious, because we have those things. And again, it's not easy. It's not hard to see the problem there, Glenn, when you cast it into a different scenario. If you have met somebody who's, again, a hypothetical kind of white racist supremacist who's going, well, I think, having white skin means that you should get a certain set of privileges. At that point, you begin, well, hang on. You are a white European. Doesn't that look a bit suspicious that you think that people who look like you should get more power and those who don't shouldn't? So it does look rather like special pleading, I think, is the first problem. And the second problem you run is the one you describe. And in fact, actually, Sam Harris, no friend of Christianity, very, very sort of fairly hardcore American atheist, once said the problem with trying to ground rights in capabilities is that, if you draw the bar too high, you start cutting off members of the human family who don't quite clear it. So if you say, you have to have certain sort of, cognitive abilities to belong to the family, within that circle of rights, what about the very disabled? What about people who are in a coma? What about people who, who are through no fault of their own, don't have the full set of human abilities? Perhaps they were born without them, or they've had some kind of, medical emergency or accident. Does that person then fallen out of the circle of care. And of course, and then he says you go the other way and you extend it too far out, suddenly you're including all sorts of bizarre things, inside the circle of rights. And it's interesting. I vividly remember doing a debate with a guy called Andrew Copson, who was then the head of the British Humanist Association
I've
at Hull
debated
University.
Him, yeah.
Nice guy. I mean, he's a lovely chap. But I remember debating him at Hull University about 3 years ago, and he kept coming back to human exceptionalism. He kept saying things like, well, humans have this duty to various other things. And at one point, I remember that in the discussion part, I did challenge him. I said, Andrew, it does seem that you can't escape human exceptionalism. I find it fascinating. You keep denying that you believe it, and then 5 minutes later, you're appealing to it. And finally, he, with a smile, because he had a sense of humor in his face, he went, yeah, it does seem a bit like the bubble on the wallpaper, doesn't it? Wherever you push it down, it pops up somewhere else. And I do admit it's rather hard to get rid of. And I think it is. And it brings us back to Genesis. Why is it that human beings have a responsibility to others that foxes don't have to fellow foxes? Why do we have a responsibility to nature and the environment, all these things? Because we bear the image of God and we stand in a special relationship to creation. Not because we're something, we are just made from the dust of the earth, but we're not just the dust of the earth. As I think it was C.S. Lewis famously said, most kids, doesn't take long to work out that there's a difference between the stuff that something is made of and what it is. And yes, we may share the material parts that we're made out of with the rest of creation, but God has also breathed his spirit into us, and we are more than dust. We're not less than dust, but we're certainly not more than dust.
Yes, and without Genesis 1, you either have, it's just an arbitrary starting point, and don't ask me for my foundations, I will just be a human exceptionalist just because, right? And we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps at that stage, and it becomes an arbitrary kind of a foundational leap of faith. Without any grounding, or it's a power play. It's we are top of the heap because we are us, and no one can stop us, and it becomes quite Nietzschean at that point in terms of a power
exactly play. And that latter line is almost the more frightening one, I think, in some ways. But I think the first line that we really aren't nothing. We really are nothing, and we maybe find some arbitrary basis, but really, if we're not careful, we just go down the we are nothing, we talk ourselves down. Well, of course, that leads to despair. That leads to the idea that life is absurd, and the kind of ideas that Camus and others played with. But you go the other way. What frightens me is that path where, well, we're top of the heap. That leads to some of the horrific abuses that we've seen in recent years, and going further back in history, but obviously the ones in recent years are closer to our consciousness of where leaders, sometimes sadly Christian leaders, but political leaders and others, have got power and abused it. Look at the Harvey Weinstein scandal from a couple of years ago. And politicians and so forth who've gone, I have power, I am going to use it. That is our direct line descendant, I think, of that idea that says the reason human beings matter is we are top of the heap, rather than actually, again, Genesis, which says it's nothing to do with being top of the heap. It's to do with being image bearers, and you're in the image of a God who doesn't throw his power around like some celestial despot. And I always say to my atheist friends, it always matters when you say that human beings bear the image of God. The next question ought to be, which God are you talking about?
Right.
Because there are some gods that I think that'd be a fairly monstrous thing. But quite frankly, when we're talking about the God of the Bible, who's a God who sacrificed himself on behalf of others, lays power down, and shows us what true power looks like in the person of Jesus, that's very, very different. Because again, of course, as Christians, if we want to know what the image of God truly looks like when it's lived out fully and properly, and so that every sense of the meaning of those terms, the Bible's answer would be look at Jesus. Don't look at political leaders. Don't look at Alexander the Great or Caesar or Boris Johnson or goodness knows whoever. Look at Jesus, because he's the one who models what the image of God in all of its fullness should look like.
Right, exactly. And I think that points to the fact that actually we have very westernized and individualized this idea called human rights. I mean, to secularize the concept of the Imago Dei and to speak really solely in terms of rights is to do damage to this ancient idea, which to begin with is about responsibility, and Adam and Eve are to have dominion over the world and to care for the world and serve the world. And as you say, you've got to continue the story on to Christ, who says, I've not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. This is what the expression of our true responsibility before God is, which is actually to take whatever authority we have and pour it out for the sake of others and to serve others. And so, as you say, Christ is that expression. He is the image of the invisible God, says Colossians 1 verse 15. And really, we need to be renewed in that image if we are to take anything into our hands as weighty as human rights, because really it's meant to be in Christ and with Christ and through Christ, to go in that way of servant leadership. Can I get you from, we've thought about an atheistic understanding of Genesis 1 and humanity. Why is it, do you think, that you trace the genealogy of ideas to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in a very Christian way? Why did Islam not come up with a similar doctrine?
Oh, now there's a question. So to answer that, we need to step back a little bit in history and look at the context in which Islam comes together. So Islam, began in the 7th century there with the career of Muhammad, who begins claiming around about 610 AD that he would receive revelations from the angel Gabriel for material that would later become the Quran, claim that God was revealing to him the foundations of a new religion. But what was going on there in the Arabia in where Muhammad operated, there were lots of other religious ideas sloshing around. And those who've done critical work on the Quran, have noticed that there's lots of Christian and Jewish and other religious ideas that the Quran draws upon, biblical stories that it retells. In fact, something like 25% of the Quran is made up of material that the Quran is picked up. I don't want to say borrowed, that's too strong a term, but certainly has been, is drawn from other sort of religious traditions, say, especially Judaism and Christianity. And I think the reason was, as Muhammad traveled preaching around Arabia, people knew these kind of stories, they knew these traditions. And so Muhammad kind of sort of picked up the building blocks that were lying there to be used as he built the religion of Islam. An analogy I've often used, and not original to me, but as if you go to the north of England, running across the north of England is the remains of Hadrian's Wall, that big wall that the Romans built to keep the Scots out, or the Scots would tell, where I live now, would tell the story the other way around. It was built to keep the English out. But yeah, there we are, there it is. If you look either side of Hadrian's Wall, you can find all of these kind of medieval farm buildings. And we know they're medieval farm buildings by the design of the building, but they're all built out of Roman stone. Now, if you were to look at those buildings and go, why were the Romans building medieval farm buildings like 1400 years ahead of their time? You'd be asking the wrong question. The question is the other way around. Why did the medieval farmers use Roman stone? Because it was lying there not doing anything. And there was all this wonderful dressed stone they could just use to build their buildings. And that's what Muhammad did with Islam. He took lots of building blocks of Christianity and Judaism and biblical stories and others and builds the Quran together. Now, fast forward down through the centuries, that then causes a problem for later Islamic theology as it develops, because the Quran has all of these ideas floating around that don't really fit together coherently. Most obvious example is Jesus. Jesus turns up in 90 verses of the Quran, mentioned by name in about 20 of them. On the one hand, the Quran wants to say he's just another prophet. He's not the son of God. He's nobody special. He is just another prophet, just like all the others. And the Quran makes that point time and time and time again. Yet on the other hand, Jesus stands head and shoulders above every other figure in the Quran. He's born of a virgin. He does amazing miracles. He raises people from the dead. He's going to come back at the end of time, on the day of judgment, at the end of history. He's got incredible titles. He's the Messiah. He's a word from God. He's a spirit from God. He doesn't really, what is going on there? And the answer is, what's going on there is the Quran borrowed Jesus and large chunks of material about Jesus from Christianity, and then tried to shoehorn into Islam. It didn't really work. And that happens across Islam. And one place this happens, to bring this long and winding tale in for a landing, Glen, is it happens in the Genesis story. So the Quran retells the Genesis story about 6 or 7 times. It retells the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. But it makes some significant changes that then have implications when it comes to things like human rights. There's a whole number of them, but particularly significant ones. Adam and Eve are not created in the image, do not bear the image of God. The Quran certainly calls Adam and Eve vicegerents, so they definitely have a kind of responsibility over creation. So that idea is there. But their status as image bearers is downplayed. Secondly, Adam and Eve are created in the Quran. They're not created here on earth. The Garden of Eden is upstairs, is in paradise. When Adam and Eve sin and are cast out of paradise, they're not actually cast out, they're cast down. And God in the Quran says to them, get down from here to the earth, which will be a place of trial and testing for you. They shall remain, but in the end, you'll be taken out. And so those are two of the big changes. And that sets up a whole cascading series of problems. It means Islam has a problem with the environment, because the earth isn't God's good creation. It's effectively, theologically, a prison camp. And I say again, it's probably not an accident that Islam really hasn't developed an ecological movement. Although Christians and the environment are not issues that perhaps fit together as well now as they should do, historically they used to. And most of the founding fathers and mothers of the environmental movement were either Christian or had Christian backgrounds. That story is being told in the book Inherit the Holy Mountain by Mark Stoll or Mark Knoll, one of the Marks, I forget which one wrote that book. Really interesting story. And then it also plays out in human rights, because Islam has not generated a human rights movement. And in fact, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came out in 1948, it wasn't long until afterwards the Islamic nations came together and came up with their own version of it, the Islamic sort of statements on human rights, which basically borrows everything that the UDHR did, but takes out and edits things around women and equality and certainly about on religious freedom, because built into all the schools of Sharia law in Islam is the idea that you cannot change your religion. There is no freedom of religious belief in Islam. It's if you are a Muslim, you are always a Muslim. But it goes back to, I think, what the Quran does with the Genesis story. It borrows it, it retells it, but it changes it, and in other ways too. But those are two of the big ones. Image of God is gone, and the good status of creation and our place within it is gone as well.
And what of the doctrine of the fall as well? I mean, we can sort of pretty easily summarize an atheistic view of the fall. Terry Pratchett sort of very memorably said, you could either think of humanity as fallen angels or as ascendant apes. And probably the more materialistic view is that we are ascendant apes. And in a sense, there hasn't been a fall. There is the evolution of the species towards what we don't know. But let's take that for granted as a more kind of materialistic view of our human origins. But within Islam, is there a doctrine of a fall, or in what sense is humanity broken, fallen in Islamic theology?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the simple answer is, and I'll put some flesh on the bones of that answer, Glenn. Simple answer is, I don't think there is a doctrine of the fall in Islam. And in fact, actually, I've got a chapter in the new book. Every author likes to do a few cheap plugs. And I've got a chapter in the new book actually exploring this, where I actually quote several Muslim theologians, making that very point, that there is no doctrine of the fall, for a couple of reasons. One is that when you read the Genesis story, what's going on there? It's not merely that Adam and Eve broke a commandment, something not to eat of the tree. There's a much deeper issue going on there. Firstly, there's this close kind of intimate relationship between Adam and Eve and God. We've alluded already to the fact, God walks and talks in the garden in the cool of the day, according to Genesis 3. It's a relationship of close communion, and also a relationship of dependence. I mean, basically, God says to Adam and Eve in Genesis, effectively, you could. There are no rules. There is nothing I require of you other than to trust me totally for your existence and as a source of goodness and justice and so forth. And symbolizing of that is, just don't touch the tree. You've got to trust me. I am the one who grounds morality, not yourself. You're not the ones who create good and evil. And live within that framework, and it's going to be wonderful, and it's going to be phenomenal. And this and the relationship that we can have will be something incredible. And when Adam and Eve sin, that's what's shattered. It's that kind of covenant, close, tight relationship with God. And of course, when they're then cast out of the garden, it's God's presence that they're separated from. That's the tragedy. It's not they simply lose a nice garden where it was fun to sit on a sun lounger of an afternoon. They lose that close presence of God. And then the ripples of that shock flow out through creation, causing all kinds of damage left, right, and center, both in terms of human relationships and in terms of creation as well. And Adam and Eve's very nature becomes corrupted as part of that process. So that's the Christian understanding. Islam does a number of things. Firstly, I think it downplays the relationship at the start. When you read the creation story in the Quran, there's no description of Allah walking and talking in the garden with Adam and Eve. Yeah, he creates Adam and Eve. He gives them the blessing of the garden and a beautiful environment to be in. But there isn't this close relationship of intimacy, is the first thing. And then secondly, when Adam and Eve sin in the Quran, really the Quran tries to play that merely as forgetfulness and a mere slip is the kind of language that Islam would use. And actually, more that you read Islamic theology that's expounded on that, that's often the language that's used. Human beings, we're not actually sinful and broken. We've just committed the odd slip. We're forgetful. We forget God's commandments, so we just need more commandments, and then everything will be okay. And I think the problem with that is it just doesn't diagnose our situation with enough honesty. And I've had many conversations over the years with Muslim friends and said, look, if we're honest with ourselves, I think we all know deep down the issue isn't we don't have the right moral information. I think the whole sordid history of humanity is actually people often do have the right moral information. We know what we should do. It's just we don't do it.
Right.
Paul in Romans 7, of course, expounds this beautifully. I know what I should do, but I don't do it. And that's the fundamental issue. And I think that as you follow that thread through, Glenn, I think you end up with these two very different visions in Islam and Christianity. Islam is ultimately good advice. Human beings, you tend to forget things, you tend to make mistakes. Here's some advice. Christianity, on the other hand, comes along and says, no, you actually need rescuing. You actually need a rescuer. And the analogy I use in the book, I'm an outdoors guy when the weather allows it. And so I use a rock climbing analogy in the book and say, I've dabbled with rock climbing. I'm pretty useless, but I like to play around occasionally. But let's suppose I really get delusions of grandeur. And once lockdown is over, I head out to Yosemite National Park. And I decide I'm going to climb on my own El Capitan, 3,000 foot granite face, one of the hardest rock climbs in the world. And I get 200 foot up this thing and I get stuck. And I am in serious trouble. Can't move left, right, up or down. And my strength is running out. I'm clinging on my fingernails. I'm doomed if something doesn't happen. And suddenly 2 rock climbers turn up at the bottom of the cliff face. And I look down and I realize that one of them is Alex Honnold, the best rock climber in the world. Starred in Free Solo, that National Geographic movie a few years ago, where he climbed that rock face unroped on his own. And he starts shouting up advice. Move left a bit. There's a good crack there, and use this maneuver. You can do it, and self-motivation sort of stuff. Next to him is an unknown climber I've never heard of, who starts pulling on his rock climbing gear, saying, "Stay right where you are. I'm going to come and get you." Doesn't matter that the first guy is the top of his field and has given me world-class advice. It's still no good because I still can't do it on my own. What I need is a rescuer. And that's the difference there between Christianity and Islam. Jesus is the one who says, I will rescue you because you can't do it on your own. Islam insists that we can. And I think that's a world of difference between those two views.
Which is an affront to our human pride and dignity, isn't it? That that we are not the climbers we think that we are, that we cannot move an inch, and we must be saved in that way. That offends both atheist and Muslim at that stage.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
This kind of doctrine of humanity. But sell us on the goodness of in research we've thought often about this idea of original sin and or Luther called it the bondage of the will, or this idea of being in Adam, that what Adam did, we're always doing. And that having been born into his family, we are shaped by this dysfunction that is part of Adam's family. And there's nothing we can do to remake ourselves. We must be born again. We must be saved. Sell us on why anyone should believe in this doctrine of being born in Adam, the doctrine of original sin.
Well, in one sense, it's interesting you slightly cheekily there put the word "sell," because I think that sort of implies that Christianity is like a self-help program and it's better than anything else in town. I think the ultimate reason you should believe it is because it's true. And let me unpack a few thoughts around that. I think the first thing about it being true, Glenn, I think for any of us who've stopped and actually thought honestly and deeply about our own lives and our own behavior, you do come to the worrying realization that we do have this pattern, we do have this tendency just to be, fairly mean, vindictive, and nasty for good chunks of the time. It's not so much we struggle to keep God's standards, we struggle to keep our own. And, one of my favorite, sort of theological apologetic books for the last few years is Francis Spufford's book from a few years ago, Unapologetic. And his chapter in there on... Is this
going to be safe for work, Andy? Is this?
No, it will be safe for work. You've read it. It's your own go. He coins this phrase, the human propensity to totally F things up. And he turns that into an acronym and uses it through the rest of the book. Now, you and I wouldn't, in polite company use that particular word, but I remember reading that chapter thinking that is a beautiful description, because he goes on to unpack this tendency we have as human beings to wreck things. I don't know about you, I catch this in myself. I can be kind and generous, but then if I'm tired, I can be snappy and grouchy with my family, the ones I love the most dear. We can all be pretty sort of selfish and self-centered, and we can do that individually in relationships, and we can do that corporately. I think if you look at some of the great, the environmental challenges facing our world, they don't ultimately come down to climate change and emissions. They come down to greed, selfishness, and apathy. And I think this is the story of the human condition. And then I think that forces you into two choices. You either turn your back and walk away and try and ignore it and deny it, or you sort of get in some sort of Pollyanna view that says, well, maybe with enough education and healthcare and development and stuff, we can build a better human. And that model hasn't ended well either. Or you end up where many people have ended up going, there is actually something going on here. And it's interesting. I've got a friend of mine who's now a Christian philosopher based in Europe. And I remember sort of Theo saying it was his he was quite a committed atheist when he was young. And what led him eventually to faith in Christ was the first step was realizing that he was a nasty piece of work. And he said, I spent years denying it, years denying that there was such thing as evil, years denying it affected me. I thought, he said, I knew I had bad habits, but I thought whenever I wanted to, I could be a nicer person. And then I tried, and along the way wrecked about 2 relationships and caused all kinds of other damage. And then finally came to the realization, actually, I can't help myself. And I think the thing with Christianity, if it just diagnosed that and went, yeah, it's this corrupted nature that we've inherited because we're all in Adam, and it stopped there, gosh, it would be miserable. It would be miserable and depressing. It might be true, but it'd still be a bit depressing. Like the doctor's cancer diagnosis, at least you know what's going on. But then doctor says, sorry, mate, there's nothing we can do. You're going to die. But for me, the beautiful thing about Christianity is God speaks to us sometimes gently, sometimes more loudly, and says, this is what's going on. Now, will you stop running and let me deal with it? Because actually in Christ, he has dealt with it. And I think, you touched on it with the pride aspect. The older I get, I turned 49 this year, so I really am, I think, officially an old fogey. The more I realize, pride is the basic issue. We do want to think we're something. And we Christians are not immune, right? People like you and I who are writers and public figures, we like to think, our videos and our books are something. We like to think that maybe we can offer God something because we're in ministry and we're doing great things, and so God probably views us with a bit more favor than others, right? Well, that's not true. And if we're outside of God's family right now, we like to think, well, I'm quite a smart person. I don't need God. Thanks very much. I'm fairly decent. I clapped for the NHS. I give it money to charity. I do the right things. We don't like it. The idea that actually we might need God's rescue, even though God has done it generously and on his own initiative, without waiting for us to make the first move. And my favorite Bible verse in that regard is Romans 5, verse 8. God's love demonstrated that while we're still sinners, while we're still his enemies, Christ died for us. And it's this beautifully simple message, and it costs us nothing. But on the one hand, that's the hardest piece, isn't it? Because we want to pay something. We want to think we've partly contributed to this.
And yet
Genesis, that's the great stumbling block.
Yeah. And Genesis 3 answers that so beautifully. And, we hide from this truth, and we hide from the reality and the nakedness and the shame, just as Adam and Eve did. And, and the ridiculousness of it in Genesis 3 is just in every line, really, that, they make fig leaves as this pathetic kind of portable hiding place to keep themselves, from God and to keep prying eyes from seeing their shame. They then play hide and seek with the Lord of the universe, which, he's quite good at hide and seek. He usually wins that one. What are they playing at? And it's the Lord who comes to find them. And then obviously he doesn't think their fig leaf covering of their true human condition is sufficient. And there's this sense of stripping away the fig leaves of their own self-covering. And he clothes them in skins. And you think, well, where did the skins come from? An animal. What happened? What had to happen to the animal? Well, the death that Adam and Eve deserved had happened to that animal. Blood was shed, and they are clothed in a sacrifice. And what's fascinating to me is in the Quran, Allah actually says to Adam and Eve, clothe yourselves in piety. Which seems like it's the opposite, isn't it? It's kind of, you're not so bad. Yes, you're imperfect, sure, but have a go. Clothe yourself in piety. Do the good stuff, and you will make yourself ever more presentable to the world. And the Christian message is the exact opposite, isn't it? Look bad in the presence of love. Be covered by the sacrifice of another. Be saved. And at that point, it's an affront both to the atheist mindset and the Islamic mindset. But if you really see the mess that you're in, it's good news, isn't it?
It is, and it's interesting the way you described it there. That comes into what Paul says in Corinthians about the cross being foolishness to Greeks and a stumbling block to Jews. So to the religious mind, it's like, well, hang on, there's a problem here. I can't possibly accept this because I've got this lovely system worked out. And then to obviously those outside of the Judeo-Christian background, it's just a load of rubbish. How does it make any conceivable sense? But I think certainly, as you angled it in terms of Islam, I think, yeah, Glenn, the Islamic position leaks all over the place. I mean, there's actually another piece in the Genesis, the creation story there in the Quran that's always fascinating me. There's the clothe yourself in piety idea. So again, the spotlight is on you. It's your effort that does that. But there's also this little moment where it's said that when Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the tree, that suddenly, they were able to see all the shame that had been hidden from them, which is a very interesting insight into the Quran's view of human beings. That human beings are actually inherently shameful, and simply before Adam and Eve had eaten of the fruit, they didn't see that shame. And that's a huge contrast, of course, to the Bible that says, well, no, human beings bear the image of God. We're in close relationship with God, reflecting all that God wanted humanity to reflect. We weren't some sort of sinful creature because we were naked or whatever. But the Quran has, I think, picked up the idea of nakedness and turned it into moral nakedness and caused all kinds of problems. And then with the idea that you could work your way out, the other thing there as well, I think it just creates so many issues. Two of the biggest ones it creates for me, Glenn, are firstly, of course, you can never know if you've done enough. And this is something I think that religion, when religion goes badly wrong, can do to people. It creates this sort of treadmill where you've got to work harder and harder and harder. If you think that you have to earn enough, moral points or do enough stuff so that God will show you favor, but you never quite know how much is enough, that is absolutely psychologically and spiritually devastating. And sadly, I know people inside the church who haven't quite got that message of grace into their DNA, and they burn themselves out, attending every prayer meeting, signing up for every committee, doing everything they possibly can because they somehow think if they do just that little bit extra, God will love them more. And I'm often saying to folks when I have those conversations, what you described there is not Christianity. It is Islam, where you can always do more and always work that bit harder. And then, of course, the other thing it leads to is the self-righteousness piece. I mean, the Pharisees, who Jesus reserves his strongest critique for in the Gospels, that was their system. They were very confident of their righteousness. They had worked hard. They had kept the law. And we forget, that they weren't making this stuff up. They weren't sort of pretending to keep the law and not doing it. If you'd been back there in the first century, you'd have wanted a Pharisee as a next door neighbor because you couldn't have asked for somebody who'd, look after their interests as well as do the neighborhoods more. But Jesus goes for them like a Rottweiler because they've used this to look down on other people and feel superior. And I do find it interesting that actually every other religion has this kind of built into it. And I've been very careful how I say that for folks listening, because I don't want to make it sound like I'm just flipping it around. I'm being superior because I'm now looking down on others. Not talking about people. I'm talking about religious systems now. The religions like Islam that do this with law, keep enough laws, and you get higher and higher and higher up the rankings, as it were. And then the temptation is to look down on others. There are other religions that do it, say, through, memorizing the right body of truths, like Buddhism. I had a friend some years ago in Toronto who was a Zen Buddhist monk. And I remember him sort of talking quite openly about how he said, I've almost attained Buddha consciousness. And that's as high as I could think I can possibly go. And I remember thinking there's all kinds of things wrong with that. Not least, I thought the idea you weren't supposed to desire anything. But yeah, even though he was the nicest person you could hope to meet, there was still this tinge of he felt he was living on some elevated plane that the rest of us mere mortals weren't. And then along comes Christianity and upends the entire apple cart. I've realized that's mixing metaphors. You can tip over apple carts, you can't upend them. But there we are. And saying that actually it's not about you. And, we as Christians, I think, read verses that says, God looks on our righteous deeds as if they're nothing more than filthy rags. And we go, well, that's very nice, because we don't appreciate the shock value of that. But for most religious systems in the world, that is totally shocking, because it is all about what you do. And it certainly is in Islam. And along comes Jesus and goes, no, I'm destroying that system entirely. That is gone. It's not about religious works or any kind of works. It's about him and what he's done.
Right, and that is good news for those who are ascendant apes and realize they can't ascend high enough, and for those who are constantly trying to clothe themselves in piety and never feeling free of the stain. Jesus has actually descended, come down to us to sacrifice for us and to clothe us with his own righteousness and raise us up. That is good news. Andy, can you can you finish with some good news? Can you play the part of the father in that Luke 15 parable? What would be your words to, on the one hand, your atheistic friend? What is, contextualize it for us? What is the good news that you would speak to your atheist friend, and then what is the good news that you would speak to your Muslim friend?
Well, I mean, I love that parable, Glenn, like many of us do. And so, I mean, just to actually encourage people who haven't looked at it or thought about it half hard. I mean, two great resources, because I love pointing people to other resources. Ken Bailey, who's a wonderful scholar of the Gospels, lived for many, many years in the Middle East and has written wonderful books helping you as particularly as Westerners understand those parables in the Middle Eastern setting. Ken Bailey wrote a wonderful book called The Cross and the Prodigal. And that's aimed slightly more at Muslims because he spent a lot of his time engaging with Muslims. So if you're a Muslim listening to this or have Muslim friends, Ken Bailey, Cross and the Prodigal. And then for atheists or secular folks, Tim Keller's book, The Prodigal God, which actually Christians should do with reading as well, actually, is I think more about what that means for those from that background. So I guess at the heart of that parable for me is, I'll start with the younger kind of son, is saying, look, the thing is, you don't need to somehow sort of think you have to get everything straight before you come to God. By which I mean, I remember talking at a university a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, before lockdown began, and at the end of it, talking to an atheist there who said, Andy, a lot of what you've shared and the other speakers have shared this week is very compelling, but I don't think I can come to Jesus. I don't think I'm anywhere near ready for that, because I've still got questions, I've still got doubts, I've still got issues that I haven't worked through, even though Jesus is very compelling. And I think what I said there is, I think I angled into Luke 15, when you can come as you are. That to me is the big takeaway from the prodigal son. You don't have to get it right. You don't have to get cleaned up. The prodigal son didn't have to wash the pig mess off him. He was able to just come as he was, and God is waiting to embrace you. He's the running father. And there's that sense of letting yourself be embraced. I think sometimes if we come from atheist or secular backgrounds, we can be slightly prickly. We're suspicious of religion. We're suspicious of a whole range of things. And we can be a bit sort of covered in stuff. And I think of just going, just be willing to come to God and go, look, I've got questions. I've got a few things I want to talk about. I haven't got all this sorted, but still come on home is what I'd say. Come as you are. Don't feel you have to get yourself in some place first of all. Right. And then I'd flip it around then and say for my Muslim friends standing at the door, I think what I'd say there, and the tragedy, of course, of Luke 15 is we don't know how the older son answered the father's plea, because Jesus leaves the story hanging in the air, because I think he's addressing it to Pharisees, and he wants them to think about how they're going to respond. And so actually with Muslims who take scripture very seriously, I would often sort of say, have a read of that parable and then get to the end and put yourself into the shoes of the older brother and think about how you respond to the father's invitation. Because the good news is that, yes, there is a God who takes commandments and law and morality seriously. Don't hear Christians to be saying we're flippant at those things. I agree with my Muslim friends that the world is in a mess, and it would be a much better place if people took God's law more seriously. So, Christians are not anti-legal, but actually we know that comes out of relationship, not a substitute for. So rather than stand outside protesting, why don't you turn around and take a look at the God who's demonstrated what he thinks of you, a God who's demonstrated how much he loves you, and a God who is not just offering to let you know his commandments, but is offering to let you know him and give you the power to live differently. And I think it's that power part that Islam is missing. It's got some, Sharia law is an incredibly complicated thing with some amazing ethical sort of theories and bits and pieces in there. But what it lacks is the power inside to make a difference. And with Christianity, you have that offer, I think, of a Jesus who will actually fill you with his spirit and give you the power to live differently.
That is great news, isn't it? If you're in the far country, come on home, join the joy. If you're in the field, come on home, join the joy. The welcome is there for you. Andy, if people want to catch up with you online, what's the best place to go?
So they can find me in 2 ways, Glenn. If you're a person who's on social media, just put my name, Andy Bannister, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, those kind of three. I know there are others, but I'm too old for those. So you'll find me on those kind of platforms and lots of content there. Or if you want the website that I hang out on, if you go to Solas, that's the organisation I run up in Scotland. So SOLAS, Solas-CPC, Centre for Public Christianity, solas-cpc.org. And we've got videos and resources and all kinds of things, both aimed at those who have a Christian faith and those of all faiths. and none. Everything's free to use, download, share, whatever. So yeah, social media or on the Solas website.
Wonderful, wonderful. Andy Bannister, thank you so much for joining us on Reset.
It's been a great fun talking to you as ever, Glenn. Have a great rest of the day.